Hello, folks, and welcome to Author Adjacent, a podcast about the journey from hobbyist writer to professional author. I'm your host, Michael Vadney, and for today's episode, I have another author interview. I'm sitting here with Kaden Love, author of Elegy of a Fragmented Vineyard and co-host of the Love and Lore YouTube channel. Is it also considered a podcast, or is it just a YouTube channel?
Like more of a YouTube channel. We just we do whatever we want with it. So we've been doing it for a couple months, and we'll see where things end up with it.
Awesome. Yeah, it's been a pretty heartwarming show, the episodes that I've caught so far. I'm a big fan. I'm already off script on this. I told you I was going to ask you a different question first, so we'll jump into that now as all these episodes start out. How did you get from where you started to where you're at now in your author journey?
Mm-hmm. So I think, like most authors out there, I've always had a love for fantasy, but I do recognize that, I'm a younger author. I am 25, but I didn't start really writing until my earlier 20s. And, so I kind of felt a little behind where people are like, oh, I grew up writing all the time. And, I had my language arts classes and things like that, like everyone, but didn't really get too much into personal fiction writing. And so when I really got going with it was when I started back in the Stormlight Archive, Brandon Sanderson's Big Thick series after, just years of breaks between the releases. And I really got into that. And then I thought, it'd be cool to create like he did. And I found his lecture series, watched all of them. And then at the same time, my younger brother that is now senior in high school really got into Dungeons and Dragons. And so I was like, okay, I love the idea of just creating your own story and playing with it. And so I played it, I've of course played the game a little, but I went so much more so to just like writing and composing my stories. And so I started with the book that is Elegy of a Fragmented Vineyard. But the first draft was twice as long and twice as bad is what I tell people. So, but it's been a long and fun journey. So that's what it's been. It's starting with an idea, really sticking to it and not giving up, even though it took me a while to finally get it out there.
No, that's pretty cool, actually. You were talking about like being behind, but actually I'd say you're ahead of the curve. Like You're 25 at this point. You already have your first book out. You didn't start writing until your early 20s. That is fantastic. Like, yeah, that shows a good sense of drive and motivation, and honestly, just dedication to the craft. But do you have like a certain process that you go through for creating your stories?
I always start with kind of a basic outline. I always tell people it's kind of like a skeleton. Thin, the bones are there. I kind of have an idea of how it's going to end, but I'll fill it in as I go. And like a current novel that I'm working on that is unrelated to my main series, it's taken a turn for where it's going to end up multiple times, just because I've kind of gone with what I felt was best. And so LG a lot was just kind of building up a cool world that I liked, a lot of lessons and thoughts that I wanted to put into it. And then, just chiseling it down and shaping it up as I went. And because, writing currently isn't my full-time job, I really have to prioritize time to write. So a lot of it is making sure on just my typical work days is getting 1,000 words in, whether that's doing some on my downtime at work and then finishing up in the evening, or just doing it in the evening and then days off, just trying to get as much as I can out there.
Well, you mentioned earlier before we started the call, and I've read around that you finished Elegy your final year of nursing school, right?
Mm-hmm. That's correct.
That sounds like it was a huge amount to juggle between like your final year, which is typically like your toughest year of school with finals and everything, and finishing a book. Did you start the book the final year of nursing, or was it before that and then it just kind of all happened to end around the same point in your life?
It was all kind of then. So the first draft was completed in 9 months, which was, I think before that last year, I started putting together ideas. And when I really set to it, it was during that last year. And, I think a big, heavy part of the workload that took longer than the first draft was really editing it. And that did come just kind of towards the end of school and after. But, the real density of writing it did take place during my college years and the last year of nursing school. So it shows how like serious I was that I wanted to get that out there. It wasn't something I was taking as just a fun, random little hobby. I wanted a book out there. I wanted it to be good. And, it was something very passionate about.
Yeah, I think you succeeded at it. I remember reading through it, and for those of you that don't know, like there is a very complex moral dilemma that happens. That's really the core of the conflict of the story and the core of the magic system, which is like harvesting of organs for the magic system for other people. And I think almost all of the organs come from the young, the infant, people who can't really have a say in it. And I remember going into the book thinking like, okay, this is going to be very clearly good versus evil. Like, obviously harvesting babies for their magic organs is bad. But I was really impressed going through the story that you had multiple POVs give some very solid points about like how in this world, in this instant, this is actually good for society. And it made it a believable argument instead of it just being like, killing babies is bad, which, yes, of course, killing babies is bad. We don't need to be debating that. But I was just very impressed with how you made this, what seems to be a black and white dilemma, very gray. Do you have any kind of like background or just knowledge or interest in like philosophy or anything like that kind of brought this to the surface as like the conflict within your story?
Yeah, I am definitely very interested in philosophy, and those that have read knows there's a lot of spiritual aspects to the book, and that kind of plays into it. And what makes a really good story for me personally is, you have to have the enemy, the villain, not just as someone that wants to be evil for the sake of being evil. And that's kind of where I went there. I wanted the antagonists, whoever you choose them to be in this, to be people that thought they were doing good. And even the most twisted of people that you would call the villains in this story believe that they are doing what is good for people as one. And, because if you're just reading a story and you have a very predictable path and you're just like, oh, here's the good guy, he's just going to be good the whole time, it doesn't add a lot of depth to it. So I wanted people to question, like, is this person doing what they should? Even if it's a very obvious hero, are they doing it for the right reasons? You get to see all the flaws come forth because of this. And, that really is the core of the story. My first initial idea was you have these courts, these city-states, each one focuses on a virtue. We have the Zaysmen that focus on perfection, obedience, which is great, until they take it to the extreme that they just forsake caring for each other, and they are so self-centered in a way that, you get to see why they're doing what they are, but it's taken so far, and that goes into how they approach it. And so all these people approach these moral dilemmas on different ways based on their culture and based on what their court, their city-state, like, preaches to be how you should live.
Yeah, there's clearly like a lot of influences. The classic to pull is like Game of Thrones and stuff like that. Pretty much like any deeply political or conflicting story nowadays is like, oh yeah, there's a Game of Thrones influence in there, and you can see like that kind of political intrigue going on in here. But I would also describe it as like it is dark fantasy because of what it deals with, but it's like it's a cleaner dark fantasy. We're not going through a grim dark here. Have you seen The Wheel, where it's like the grim dark, noble bright, noble dark, and I can't remember what the fourth one is.
I know what you're talking about, though. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's almost on the wheel there because it is a deeply like complex genre that you're dealing with. When at the same time, like, yes, we're dealing with these difficult situations, but you present them in a way where it's like, I'm not going to be going in and we can turn it off by the gratuitous violence or things like that, which is very impressive considering, again, this is organ harvesting magic. How did you balance that line while writing the story?
I mean, to go back to say that Sanderson's been one of my biggest influences is one of the things I love about the Stormlight Archive is that I would pitch it as an adult fantasy, but it's not necessarily because there's adult content. It's because of, or I guess explicit content, but the subject matter can be really heavy and it causes you to think, that I do love Game of Thrones. I love A Song of Ice and Fire, but there are some things in there that, some people won't read the series because it is in there. And I want it to be approachable for vast majority of people, a lot of it based on my own personal values. And I never, and that's the funny thing, that I didn't ever intend it to be grimdark. I wouldn't even say it's grimdark because there's a lot of hope that there's a lot of people trying to do what is good, but the subject matter is very heavy. And so it's always been interesting for me to pitch because you have the people that when they hear organ transplant magic, they buy it immediately, or they're like, I'm not even touching that. And I think it can hit both people well. It can do, it can suit all parties. And it is a darker fantasy, but like I said, that, it's not a focus too much on just like the gore. There's no sexual explicitness. It's just, it is what it is. It's a focus on the story. And when people ask, okay, what age should someone be to read this? I say adult. A younger, a teenager can read it. I don't know if they're going to get all that's happening. And, someone that is an adult that isn't very familiar with fantasy might not understand because it is complex. It's a lot of world building. And I understand that completely. That is, I say, like one of the biggest complaints about people that want general fantasy, but it's a little heavier.
When you start getting outside of like your stereotypical, like the elves, the dwarves, the castles, like your typical medieval fantasy setting, that's when you start getting into the difficulties of like trying to introduce your world to new readers, especially readers who are not heavy into fantasy. I feel like when you have a reader who's, yes, they've read Brandon Sanderson, but they've gone deeper into like more complex fantasies, it's a little easier to sell those kind of stories to them. But the magic system is very polarizing for readers. I can definitely understand that. But it is adult by complexity instead of adult by explicitity. Explicitity. I think that's how you say that word.
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah. Which I agree. That is something Sanderson does very well. Like he has very complex themes about loss and guilt and being a good person. And you touch on a lot of those things in here. I am a big Brandon Sanderson fan as well. I love those BYU courses. They are super useful. Can't remember if I've talked about them on the show before, but like listeners, if you haven't heard of them before, go on YouTube, BYU Sanderson, bunch of free courses. Check them out. There's the plug for Sanderson. We have paid our tithe.
Yeah.
I am a little curious. What difficulties did you run into in tackling this complex like theme that you're going throughout the story of like being a good person? Like, did you struggle with coming up with those arguments for the various sides of that dilemma? Or is that something you kind of anchored onto the themes of the city-state?
I think it was very difficult, actually, because like you said, that you hear organ transplant, baby harvesting, like these are not things that you would ever associate with good people. So it was very easy to sell Fenrir, the first character that you meet, his point, because it opens up with a very bleak scene of him harvesting an infant's organs and being like, this is horrible. I've been doing this for so long because I've been forced to, and I can't do it anymore. And readers understand that. But when we go to the next character, that's a complete switch. And I did that intentionally. I wanted people to show like, this isn't a very black and white. There are people that are trying to do what is right from the other side. And so working that into like, okay, why are they harvesting? It's to give it to adults, to progress society, to accomplish all these things. For an example, you can look at, okay, because this group of people, they have this organ, we can throw any guilty criminals in prison knowing exactly what they've done because someone can read their minds. But then, you keep adding more things like that. And you're like, okay, where do we draw the line? Is it really worth it? Do we do we let these kids grow up to eventually reach that, or do we utilize them right now? Do we utilize them right now if there's a higher chance that they die at childbirth just because of that extra organ? And so a lot of those early ones was actually when I had my wife was going through the first draft, and she was just kind of helping me in some of those arguments because it was difficult. It was seemed very like, here's bad guys, here's the good guys. And why would you ever harvest infant organs unless you're some freak? But when you see that, half of this content is in support of it, there have to be reasons. And so that was a big obstacle to get over, but I felt like I gave it justice, even though it's still an odd argument to make.
It is, but like I said, I was very impressed while reading it. I fully thought there was no way you were going to be able to sell this on to me through characters, but there was 2 or 3 of them, I think, where they're having a discussion about it. And I was just really blown away. I remember putting the book down and turning to my wife and being like, this just happened, and I didn't think that this would work, but it's working, and I don't know why. So hats off to you. I'm very impressed. So something I did want to ask you is, how many drafts did it take you to write your book? So on this podcast, we talk a lot about going from like writer to author and just trying to give like an insight into your own process. How many drafts did you run through before your like idea to complete book?
Okay, this one was a long one. This book literally was twice as long. Honestly, there were no major events taken out with the edits. And one thing that I was told by so many people is, for your debut novel, you need to get under 150,000. And I'm like, I can get under 200,000. We'll see where that ends up. But, it ended up working. And it was such a great learning process because I don't know how many like solid concrete drafts I went through, because of course I had first draft, then went through on my own, started to get some feedback, and I actually had very few readers that actually finished it. So that was very telling me of something. There's problems here where people getting hung up. Did another one. And then those that know, like Bookborn and Zach Argyle that wrote the Threadlight trilogy, they run an indie fantasy fund competition every year. And the year that I actually won it with the first chapter of Elegy, I won free editing from Sarah Chorn, who does Ryan Cahill, a ton of very big names out there. And so, yeah, she's amazing. She made Elegy what it is today. But we hit a point where she's like, Kaden, you just need to, like, I want you to make this novel really good. There's so much potential, but it needs more work. And so we got maybe halfway through it, and she's like, okay, now that you've seen how I've kind of corrected it, the changes that you need to make, the lens you need to view it through, I went through it all again and just hacked away, took out things that didn't need to be there, over explaining. And like, I just saw things in a completely new way where, once we went back, I was so much more ready. So that was like, honestly, probably 4th or 5th draft. And then I went through after that editing, did a whole more clean one, and then sent it to my ARC readers and touched it up even more there. It went through so many different phases. And a lot of that, I think, more experienced writers won't have to do as much as I did, because now I recognize how big of a difference it is just when you understand what it means to edit a book as much as you can on your own before sending it to an editor. You really realize the quality that you need to look out for. And so Duet of Pernicious Eels, the sequel, I finished the second draft pretty quickly. I had a lot of beta readers finish it, and I'm actually getting it ready to send to my editor in about a week or 2. And I just felt so much more confident. So like, went from maybe like 8+ drafts to where this one will maybe end up being 4 or so.
Yeah, the first book is definitely like a learning curve. Not only are you learning how to write, but you're learning the processes that work best for you. That's amazing that you're able to win that contest to like get free editing. That is a huge leg up. That's awesome.
Yeah, and I feel like that was the moment where I actually had a little bit of confidence in myself that this can be a good book. Like, and my editor was super ecstatic and just super helpful throughout the way. And it just really made me feel like I had a good piece. And it was just one of the most reassuring things because like those earlier drafts, especially my wife struggled to get through it. And then now that like the audiobook is out, she went and read it because I'm like, Seema, you have to read this. It is a changed book. And she loved it the next time. And now she's going through the second book and it's just such a big improvement that I think it's so easy to get hard on yourself with that first draft, just like thinking, oh, this is garbage. But like one of the things that I love that Neil Gaiman has said in, I don't know, one of his books or other, that, you know, the first draft is you telling yourself the story. The second draft is you actually like getting it there, you know?
Well, I love that. It's a trilogy of quotes. I don't know if all of what I'm about to say is from Neil Gaiman, but it's like the first one is you telling yourself the story. The second draft is fixing all the problems with the story. And then the third draft is just polishing it and sharpening all the knives to make it interesting.
Yeah.
No, I like that a lot. It's always really nice when you read a debut novel and then you read their second novel or later work that you've done and you can see the vast improvement of their work. That's always very satisfying. So you're sending your second book off to your editor right now. Do you have a date or a region that you're aiming for to releasing the second book of that series?
January. So that's the plan. Yeah, I feel pretty happy that will be a year after book one. And with kind of how I've figured out how to write and get a good schedule out, I hope to have the next one done maybe by end of next year. We'll see. But I think that, you know, that it was just, there were multiple months of editing book one, whereas this one, I think it'll just be a clean, we'll go right through. And it's one like some of my beta readers said that, you know, it blew book one out of the water, even though they liked book one, which I am so excited to share it with people because it's just like, okay, you saw me grow. You saw what I at that time was the best that I could produce. Here's me really being able to show off what I can do.
Yeah, showing off everything that you've learned from the process of book. That's awesome. Yeah, It's a great way to just be like, hey, I have so much potential. You saw how much I improved with 2 books. Watch what I do with 3 and then 4 and then 5. Stick with me. I like that attitude.
Yeah, exactly.
So because of the subject of your book and you were saying the length of it, were those some of the reasons that motivated you to do self-publishing as opposed to going traditional?
You know, I actually never considered doing self-publishing until there's an author, his name is Keon Arladon. He wrote a book called The 11th Cycle, and he did very well because he pitched his book to a certain niche. Dark Souls and Berserk both had very big followings, and he pitched his as a novel of that. And when I was nearing the end of, I think, my second draft, I saw his book pop up with a lot of influencers, booktubers, etc. And I just reached out to him and saying like, hey, I'm trying to work on getting my book ready for publishing. Like, do you have any advice? Awesome guy. We sat down and had a Zoom call for a couple hours. And, you know, one of the first questions he asked is like, okay, are you planning traditional or self-published? And I'm like, oh yeah, traditional. Like, I'm going to query. And he's like, okay, let me tell you why I'm going in indie, why he did his indie. And that just changed me. I didn't even query a single thing with this. I wanted the book out there. I won't hide the fact that I'm very impatient. I wanted people to read this, and I've really loved and appreciate. I've been very fortunate because I know there's so many books out there that are self-published that have been given years and years of work that don't even receive the attention that mine has in its short amount of time. But I've just been very fortunate, like I said, with Sarah Chorn editing my book. My wife is by profession a book illustrator. She did the cover. And so I had an easy entry, which, you know, paying for editing, and like if someone's considering doing self-publish or traditional, paying for editing and a book cover are 2 big things that might turn someone away from it because they're big expenses. And if you want a sellable book, there are so many self-published books that deter people from reading it because they don't look professional. And so being able to do that was really great. And I did initial Kickstarter release just because I'd heard a lot of people that had success with it. I talked with a bunch, and this just a series that's always been kind of on my mind now as self-published. It doesn't mean that I won't query other books for traditional in the future. But like I noticed that you had Adrian Gibson on your podcast too, good friend of mine, and he's talked to so many people in the business, and he said that he's just set on hybrid, that if he can be traditional, he's definitely sticking to indie because of the freedom that it gives you. And just with this book series being complex as it is, it was a longer first book. Like you said, it is difficult to pitch in the field. While it is gripping, it isn't the easiest slide in entry point. You've got to give it a couple chapters before you feel comfortable in the world. And you look at like one of my favorite fantasy series, like Steven Erickson's Malazan series. I love it. I wouldn't recommend it to anyone except diehard fantasy fans. And I did want this book to be more approachable by those that just like fantasy in general.
I've heard a lot about the Malazan series and how it just throws you in and doesn't really answer a lot of the questions. It just goes, you'll figure it out along the way at some point. Yeah, I would also say Adrian is great. Like, he is huge in reaching out to people and just being like, hey, you can talk to anybody. This is how I do things. Definitely shout out Adrian for the help that he's been given just the community in general. But I would say yours is definitely more closer to what Sanderson does, where there is a bit of a learning curve to the world. And again, that's going to happen anytime the further you get away from your typical fantasy setting. You have to teach the reader what's different. You have to teach them what's different about what they've read before and about the world that they experience every day. And the further you get away from one or both of those, the more pages you're going to have to dedicate towards teaching them how all this works. So there's that huge tie-in that you have to do. But I would say yours isn't too bad, because I've read some books where it's like you get to 10 chapters in and you're still learning how things work and haven't quite kicked off the story. Your story kicks off in the very first chapter. We learn very early what the problem is and what the conflict is and who is going to be doing what. And then you get to sprinkle in those bits along the way, discovering all the powers that people get from these transplants. I think it was one of my favorite parts. That, and every time we ran into someone from one of the other city-states, I'm like, awesome, what's your value? What do you do? What is your culture? Everything. What's your food? There's a lot of interesting food bits that really distinguish all the people from it. How did you balance sprinkling in all of that world building while still continuing to move the story along and get the reader to understand these are your characters, this is what they're about? How did you balance all of that?
Yeah, I think it's a lot of that comes in that growth as an author and drafting, where especially the first chapter and even more so the first three, where you get to meet our first three characters, is, the initial drafts were so heavy, so info dumpy, and you just really need to recognize, okay, like you said, you're teaching people, but what do they need to know at this point? I think, if you could absorb everything, it'd be awesome to just start the first chapter, know all the abilities, everything, all the cultures. And I think that that's a misconception people might get when I put the glossary in the beginning. I only did that because as a reader, I love having a glossary that I can turn to.
Glossaries are the best.
Yeah, I want you to know that it's there. When people say, okay, I just finished the glossary, now I'm grading, I'm like, why? There's things in the glossary that aren't even talked about in that first book. They're references to cultures later on. And a lot of it is just figuring out who our characters are. We look at Yetrick, the third character that you meet, just certain things about him. We learn about his curiosities, which is something that becomes a very big part in the story, just because I want him to be a curious guy. In his downtime, he likes going away from his bureaucratic and logistic duties to just explore knowledge. We see the religion in Aerie and the Zaysman because that is such a pinnacle to her as a character. And whenever I needed to really teach something about the world, I had to do it through a character. Rather than just talking about beastlings, the people that can talk to animals, I introduce you to Runeth, one of my favorite characters that I made, and I tried to make him memorable, and so that when you have that, you can connect it there. So whenever you have something, like I always talk about how the Zaysmen don't like a lot of seasoning in their food. They like it very basic. They like exactness and plainness. You show that as a contrast when someone from outside the court goes there. And I think that's the natural way. And it might come in later drafts if you recognize, okay, I need to teach this now. You can have someone mention it and then make it feel more natural as you go in later. If it needs to be through a character or a specific interaction, or just make it happen through the story so it feels normal, just like as if you're going throughout a day. And if I'm learning about another culture, maybe it's because I have a friend invite me out to dinner to try some food for this place. It's not just something that's forced, but it's something that comes natural, that it doesn't jar the reader away from it, make them think, okay, here's a text box that I was supposed to read, but this is something that like the people of the world are teaching me.
Well, that makes sense, because often when we interact with things that are different, we automatically compare them to something that is similar within our own world or contrasting. So, for instance, the food, I like my food very plain. I go to this place that has a bunch of spicy food, or vice versa. You're immediately thinking, this is too spicy, I prefer it plain back at home, or this is too plain, I prefer the spicy back at home. Like, the comparison really draws you in to people's everyday lives. I had a thought, and then I totally lost it. Oh, yes, got it. So the glossary back in the front of the book, I'm hoping that becomes more and more of a trend. So speaking of Adrian, he actually does something similar with Mushroom Blues, because there's information in there that will teach you to make your introduction into the book a lot easier. And yours is a lot like that too, because you have all of this complex world building. And for the people that really enjoy glossaries, which for me, that's one of my most favorite parts, learning about the world, you can get that little bite of it and then get into the story. But it's not required for people that just want to jump right in. Like, it doesn't lift away responsibility from you as the author. So you kind of have both avenues for the reader, the one that wants to get in the world building and the one that goes, please, give me the story now. But I'm hoping glossaries at the beginning of books becomes more of a trend, like maps. You have your map, your glossary, then the story.
Yeah, and like there's just some that like in Malazan, there are some times where it's limited. You look at the glossary, it's just the person's name, it says nothing about it, and I'm like, I have to go look on the wiki to figure out what this is. Whereas like A Song of Ice and Fire, the Game of Thrones series, whenever there was a character that I heard their name, I don't remember who they are, I could look in the back and see which house they're related to. And that's the thing. A lot of the choices I made in this book are just because I like that as a reader. The next book is going to include in the previous book, like just a thing to remind you what happened in book one, because there are so many things that like I wish I had that. And for people that, read Elegy at this time and read it next year, if you're anything like me, I forget about a book I read like a couple of weeks ago, unless I have a reminder. So to have that, even if it's just like a brief couple paragraphs, it is so helpful.
Well, it's huge. Like, especially when you go a year or more between reading the different entries into a series, you've read somewhere between 10 to 30 books between then, depending on who you are.
Yeah.
You have to wash through all of those stories to dredge up the memories of the specifics of what happened in this particular story to apply to this one. So those little introductories of like last time on this episode of yada yada are fantastic. Those are super useful. I want to see these trends grow for sure.
I know, exactly. Make things so nice.
So you have talked about going hybrid in the future, and you've already finished the second book of it's called the Paladins of Harvest series, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Are you planning for it to just be a duology? Because you said you're working on a new book that's a different series.
So Paladins of Harvest will be at least a trilogy. I say that because I know how the trilogy will end, whether I do like an era 2, whether it just starts a whole new story arc after that. We'll see. I love the world. I put a lot into it, but the way the whole conflict is going on now and how it will resolve won't be able to perpetuate too much longer. And like, I know the definite end of this trilogy. But back to the other book, I love drafting. Drafting is my favorite part. And because like, I mean, like first draft, getting that initial stuff out there, whereas editing like hurts. Like even if I'm doing my own editing, it's like looking at my flaws. Whereas like when I'm writing that first draft, I feel on top of the world. So while I had this like month and a half, 2-month break while my beta readers read book 2, I considered, do I want to write a novella? Which is I did with book 1. I wrote Beast Call while that was being read by my beta readers. Instead, I decided to give my all and write another book. This one is a cyberpunk book, and it is going to be around like 80,000 words. So much shorter, but this is one that I don't know where it will go, but I'm going to try to query it just for the heck of it. Like, give it some time. If it doesn't, I'm just going to publish it, but it will hit the market. I don't know when.
I think based on what you were saying with how much cuts that you had to do, you're a very verbose writer, I assume.
Yes.
Like the words just fly out. And I feel like every time I talk to someone who is a verbose writer, they love the first draft stage because it's just like, I can write as much as I want. No one can stop me. I'm very much on the opposite end. I'm very lean in writing, very minimal. So I love the editing because that's when I can go back and be like, oh, I already know what happens. So now I can make it interesting. I can make everything sound really cool now. I love the dichotomy of that and how you find like these trends of people who tend to do this are these kind of writers. Is there any kind of like trend that you have really latched on as far as that goes? Like, I think one I like to point out is that people who tend to plot have tighter stories, but people that tend to pants have very beautiful characters in their stories.
Yeah, and I think I like that where, I am definitely more of pants. Like, that's why I think I like the first draft is because even though I have an idea of where the story's going, I'll surprise myself. Like, I'll start writing, I'm like, oh, whoa, it's like I'm reading a book for the first time. And I think that's one of the beauties that there are so many differences in authors where you're like, oh, wow, this author just wrote a 60-page outline. And it's like, I'm just winging it here. Like, I'm not doing anything close to that. But there are so many successful authors out there doing both. And it's just whatever way you like it, there are benefits to both. And it's honestly just whatever makes you happy and gets the best story out of you.
Yeah, I've had a lot of debates with people on the internet about like which is better here and there, but ultimately, like the conversation should always end with do what gets words on the page. Whatever gets you writing, that's what matters the most. And as long as conversations end with there, most of them have been like very heartwarming and comparative sometimes because the writing community, I've said it before, is just so nice and so welcoming. And anytime you just want to reach out and be like, hey, I want to debate or talk about this, people will show up and be like, I want to talk writing. Let's do that.
Yeah.
I think that's a big reason why there's a lot of popularity with like podcasts like this one and Fanboy Addicts and like all kinds of these author interview shows that are really like popping up, especially in the fantasy and sci-fi space. They're just huge. I can't remember who it was. I actually just saw on Twitter today, someone who's been running a podcast for a while just did their first author interview. I wish I could remember who it was. But there's been a lot of like popping up with that. Bringing that back to this, was that a big motivator for you doing, one, your big social media presence, and then two, your Lore and Love show? Was that in support of the writing, or did it start because of the writing, or did the writing start that?
I definitely started like in support of it. So I originally started just my personal Instagram, and then I did like meet some people, made some connections that leaned me more towards Twitter. And that's where I just figured, okay, this is the big author hangout. And one of the things that, like, touching back on indie authors and self-published authors, I felt like they were so much more approachable. Like, while there are some amazing traditional authors that I've met, they are harder to get a hold of because some of them are so big and they just get so many people reaching out to them.
Yeah.
But once I got that going, and then I got my bookstagram, my book Instagram that has just kind of exploded because of consistency. That was just fun to make, but it was always, to kind of promote my book, to get a way out there, because it is hard to, constantly have sales when it's not on every bookshelf out there.
Yeah.
The Love and Lore came apart because I actually got my wife really into reading because she's an artist, and I got her into audiobooks, which is how she does all of her reading. Just because she can fly through them while drawing, because that's her job. And she actually had a very big, successful YouTube channel, and on the side, she does like videography, photography, and so she had all the experience, and I just had to come to her with ideas. Love and Lore, honestly, is just more for fun. It would be cool if something happened out of it, but it is just kind of to have fun and to have a place where we can both talk about books that we love with each other. Whereas, my Instagram is, I like talking about books. I love the interactions I have on there, but a lot of it is just to get my book out there.
Like with self-publishing, you have to do all of the social media and stuff because it's just you can't give up that platform, that way of getting your voice out there, because you don't have a giant traditional publishing house to rely on to do all your advertising for you. You have to do it all yourself. And you do have like a very strong social media presence. Do you have any advice for anyone who is trying to like get in there and either start on either Twitter or Book Talk or anything like that? Like, what would you say to them, someone who's trying to get started there?
So Twitter is definitely just to be a friend. Like, Twitter, I see as it is a place where you can make sales and interactions. There are plenty of readers out there, but I feel like the big benefit is making friendships, even though it might sound kind of weird, just with authors on there. Big thing to do is read self-published books and just talk about how much you love them. Gunmetal Gods is one of my favorite books that I've read by a self-published author. And I've made a friendship with Zamil Akhtar, that author, just because I've really just blah, blah, blah so much about how much I love his books. And that's just kind of how I've learned to grow some good relationship. If you love a book and talk about it, sometimes people do the same for your book. And so there is, honestly, even if you haven't read a book, Sons of Darkness by Gaurav Mohanty, before I even read it, I thought the cover was so cool. The idea of the Indian Game of Thrones, I was so sold. And I just made sure to share so much about it so that when it hit the shelves, I read it, I loved it, and talked about it more. And he's been a good help to me too for advice. Book Talk and Instagram are like kind of the same thing, but a little different. TikTok's kind of weird because I feel like I really do see things there. TikTok tends to be a lot more of quick videos, really fast attention spans, a lot of the same romantasy books. Whereas Instagram, I feel, reaches a much broader audience. And I actually started with just TikTok. I would post 3 videos a day, and I still keep to that strict schedule. And that is the tip to success. Record 3 videos a day, have it be about, you got to start just talking books in general so you get a book following audience, and then you can work in your stuff. But TikTok, I reached about 1,500 followers and then just plateaued. And around that time, I started posting the exact same videos that I would at that time onto Instagram, a separate page I created other than my personal one. Just because my personal one is still I've got a lot of random high school friends, family, and even though it is my professional author account, I didn't want a lot of people to get bothered because I post 3 times a day. And doing that, it just, it kept going. I kept getting followers, and it got to the point where, like, there was a stretch of a few weeks where I was getting 1,000 followers a week, and I'm now at 13. Yeah, I'm at 13,500 right now. And I would say maybe get 100 more followers every like week and a half, 2 weeks. It's still growing, but it's not as much. And it is because I post just it's positive book content. I recommend books. I give brief reviews of them. I make dumb memes, and sometimes they make people laugh. And like it's so much luck based. It is posting 3 times a day. And then like I had one thing where it was like, it showed me typing at the computer, and it said, sometimes I want to take a break, but then I remember him. I looked to the side, and it's a picture of Brandon Sanderson, and it says like, I wrote 2 books while you were sleeping. It was dumb. People shared it, and it reached like 500,000 views. I did nothing there except put a little idea out there. Sometimes I make reels, and I think it's a genius idea, and it gets nothing. So it's honestly just how writing is. You just got to keep consistent with it. You learn what people like and don't like. But most important is just being a positive influence, talking about things you like, supporting others, and they end up supporting you.
Yeah, that's fantastic. You must be making a lot more than a few people laugh with that kind of success.
Yeah, exactly.
So it seems consistency seems to be the key here for when pushing all these out. I remember a while ago after Elegy came out, I saw one of you where you actually went to Sanderson and gave him a copy of your book. And given like how much you've talked about him, I'm assuming, well, you've mentioned he's like a big influence on like your work and how you've got to. How was that experience, like meeting one of your writing heroes?
Like, and that's the thing, that he is definitely my biggest inspiration. Like if people say like, I want to be the next, it's definitely, I want to be the next Brandon Sanderson. I really admire his work, and it was definitely surreal. Because, it is odd for me now to see how big he is, because I'm from Utah, the same state that he is. So when I was in high school and reading Mistborn, it was like, yeah, he's a famous-ish author, like people know about him, but he's still a local author. Like people know about him around here, to the point where now it's like, wow, people in like the UK are talking about him. People in other countries, they're all translating different languages. And to have him have like the best-selling Kickstarter of all time, and really reach like maybe like the most famous fantasy author at this time, like I guess living, and to go and meet him, and it was just so cool. And of course, it's like, he's like, I can't make any promises, but like, thank you, I'll accept it. And if I get to it, I get to it. He's just a genuine, like very nice person. And I honestly haven't had any interactions with any authors that are bad. And it is so weird to see, it's the same thing with like any celebrities, that you recognize how just human they are. Which is even more bizarre for me to have people like get excited over my books. At a few like local signings, just people that have stumbled on my Instagram, they're like, hey, I follow you. Like, it's really cool to meet you in person. Like, recognizing that I have a large amount of followers that are going to be at the Dragonsteel convention in December. I have a booth there, and having people say they're excited to come meet me is like, what are you talking about? I'm excited to meet you. Like, the fact that anyone is like excited about something that I did, like, it is so cool. And I think that that's really the joy that comes of it, is that, when you give a book all that you can, you write so much, and to have someone appreciate it and say that it meant something to them, it makes it all worth it. Like, maybe someday it'll be crowds of people, and maybe it'll just be the same like 10 people that really love my book.
Well, that's really cool experience to look forward to. I will definitely agree with like the authors being human comment. It is incredible to me just how we were talking about it earlier with the writing community, just how accessible and just down to earth so many authors are. Like, if there is someone that you read their book and you absolutely loved it, you can reach out to them and be like, hey, this was awesome. And I remember the first time like Mark Lawrence commented on like a tweet that I made, that made my whole day. I was just like, oh my God. But it's just incredible how accessible everybody is in these situations. And like we were saying earlier, most of them just want to talk shop or just be appreciative of you, because without the readers, like, we don't really have much to do. Yes, we write for ourselves, but we also write to share the story.
Yeah, and that's the thing. I always tell people, if you want advice, especially if you want to be self-published, go and get, there are like that. The way to do it is to ask people what they did and kind of piece all your information together. There's so many ways to go if you're going traditional, but like I said, those people can be a little bit hard to get in touch with, which is nothing against them. And that's something I've had to realize, that there's so many cool authors that I've reached out to, I've tried to have interactions with, that just nothing ever happens. And seeing it on the other end, like, I'm no celebrity, but having 13,000 followers, a lot of time will kind of filter out who the messages you see. And, you know, when I get someone ask me a question about writing, I love to answer it. But a lot of times too, if I can't even answer like some text that my cousin sent me the other day, just because I set it aside because I want to get to it like at that moment, nothing against you. And so, like, never take it hard. And if someone's rude to you, that's their problem. But so many people are out there, they had the exact same experience you did. And so, especially like when I went to that first big indie author that he sat down and we talked together, I like asked him, is there anything I could do for him? Can I, like, I'll share things about your book. And he's like, just pay it forward. Like, he's like, when I was at your stage, a big author did this for me. And so that's what I'm trying to do now. You know, I'm not super big, but I've had experience enough that, like, a guy messaged me last night and he's like, hey, like, are you in this area? Cause we're both in Utah. And I'm like, no, I can drive down there. Like, he just wanted to get into indie publishing, has some questions. And I'm like, yeah, I'd love to meet up, share all that I know. I feel like I could go and rant in front of a classroom at this point, because this, like, education has been like the last few years of my life.
No, that is phenomenal. I love that whole idea. There's so many people that either just, like, you can just reach out to them, and the worst thing that happens is they either say no or they just don't get back to you, because, again, authors are human and there's only one of them and however many of everyone else that's trying to get to them. It all makes sense. Now, that's really beautiful that you have all those teaching moments. But we are running out of time, so I think this is actually a good moment to start wrapping up. Where can the people find you and find your book?
Yeah, so you can look up, my website is Kaden R Love, Kaden, the letter R love.com. I'm also at Kaden Love Author on Instagram, Twitter. You can look up Elegy of a Fragmented Vineyard. Beast Call is the free novella to anyone that subscribes to my newsletter. You can find that in any of my social media bios. If you want the bookstagram that I was talking about, it is at SVETLING Press, Vetling Press. And you'll find my face on there talking about books.